Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. Patriarchy literally comes from the ancient Greek and means rule of the father. It's a culture rooted in a gender-based two-part binary hierarchy. Human capacities are either masculine or feminine. Male privilege is central. Some men are over other men, but all men are over all women. It's seen as the oldest form of discrimination and domination in human history. In classical Greece, men's virtue was seen in managing the affairs of the city, the world, business, and war. Women's virtue was in looking after the house and obeying her husband. Aristotle went further. He portrayed women as morally, intellectually, and physically inferior to men. He saw them as the property of men, claimed that women's role in society was to reproduce and to serve men in the household. Male domination of women was understood as natural and virtuous. Now, there was no single event that initiated patriarchy, and it probably developed in different parts of the world at different times. Marx believed it emerged with the development of the idea of private property. He thought the first form of unequal distribution of labor and property was in the family, where women and children were considered the property and slaves of men. Ancient Greece and the Greek city-state of Athens in the early 5th century BC also developed the first known democracy in the world. The Greeks were severely conflicted over their creations. Autocracy comes from two Greek words, autos, meaning self, and kratos, meaning power. Autocracy, power or rule of the self, or dictatorship. Demos in Greek means the people. Democracy was power or rule of the people. In a new brilliant book called Why Does Patriarchy Persist?, Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snider show how America is beginning to understand what the ancient Greeks struggled with. Patriarchy and democracy are two contradictory systems working at cross purposes that cannot coexist. Lincoln defined our American democratic system as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he made it very clear, a house divided against itself could not stand. Gilligan and Snider point out that despite decades of activism on gender inequalities and equal rights to fulfill America's democratic promise, we are now enduring a U.S. president who is unabashedly and uncompromisingly patriarchal to his existential core. Tens of millions of Americans are in shock as we as individuals and as a people grapple with the very real threat of losing our democracy and precious freedoms. Decades of progressive advances and hard-fought liberties are now in question in the face of a shrill rage from the White House and appeals to force, war, fear, greed, humiliation, shame, and disrespect by a president who says he wants to make us great again. Even more profoundly damaging, as Gilligan and Snider argue, is how this renewed call to patriarchy is a call to sacrifice our basic human capacity to love, nurture, and care for ourselves, others, and protect the precious sanctity of the world and nature we all need to survive and flourish. There are powerful psychological mechanisms underpinning patriarchy that may be driving our politics that otherwise seems inexplicable. We've reached a point of no return. It's not only the American house divided against itself, it's the world's humanity and capacity to love itself and others that's at stake. And that's the central question of the book. Where we need to start. How do we explain the stubborn persistence of patriarchy? Why does it persist? Which way will we go? The ancient Greeks understood this and understood the choices. This book will help Americans understand it too. So welcome Naomi Snider, co-author of Why Does Patriarchy Persist, to the Radical Imagination. It is great to have you here.
It's wonderful.
This is a absolutely terrific book.
Thank you.
Here it is, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? It's fabulous to have you here to explain your major thesis, how you've come to write this book. It's an important book. It's going to be a classic. It really is. It really touches on the psychology, the political nature of this phenomenon. So help us and help our audience understand a little more about what you mean by patriarchy, how you yourself got involved in this incredible work.
I thought you gave a very good definition of patriarchy. I think.
Thank you.
I think it's complicated because a lot of people see it as simply male domination of men dominating women, and I think what we point out in the book is it's, and I think you did that in the introduction. It is a little more complicated by that because it is a system of gender-based domination, but it's based on this gender binary. And this splitting of what are essentially human capacities into either masculine or feminine. So in that way, the way you describe like a divided house can't stand, it doesn't just divide us politically, it divides us internally. So women, under these kind of constraints of femininity, become divided from parts of themselves that are deemed masculine, and men, under kind of pressures to be seen as masculine, real men, become divided from the more feminine, parts of themselves.
So it's the deepest levels of our being.
Yes.
That we're unaware of as society, as this powerful force controls us, socializes us. This is not a biological determinism, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's quite the opposite. We're saying that rather than, you can go crazy with debates of nature, nurture, and to be honest, we're all creatures that are socialized. So in a way, you'll never really know the answer to nature versus nurture. But kind of to just step back and say, if this was all just nature, it would not need to be so rigidly enforced. Sort of based on Carol's research, which we explore in the book, we look at how for boys it's typically the age of 4 to 5, girls a little later, it's kind of the age of 11, 12.
These binary definitions come to be placed.
Exactly.
Now, is this Western society? Is it,
Our research, it's actually only looking at in American schools. This is what this is based on. But I've read, there's a great book, I'm going to forget the name of the author, but that looks at kind of patriarchy in he's an anthropologist and looks at it in other countries, and it's really fascinating because what he shows, he looks at masculinity. Gilmore, his name is.
Okay.
And he basically shows that they differ somewhat, but these rites of initiation he's just thinking at boys, happen sort of across cultures,
and
which
it's
is
long-standing, as I said, thousands and thousands of years old.
Yeah.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time on how this all came about, because we want to focus on why it persists and how we could deal with it in our study. But how did this come to be?
Yeah.
Early rural agricultural society. Hunter-gatherers and so on.
How did patriarchy come to be?
Yeah.
We don't, in the book, we're really looking at why it still exists now. There's a great book called Mothers and Others, which kind of dispels this idea that, that the hunter-gatherer kind of way of being, which is a kind of patriarchal model, is the original kind of position. She looks at actually how very, very early on it was kind of villages of mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, grandmothers that would basically
extended clans.
Exactly. Exactly. That was the kind of primary model
to survive. We needed each other.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm like, at some point that clearly changed.
Right.
And the question is, because from that standpoint, it's so contrary to our survival. It kind of it's not healthy. So
Patriarchy.
So why does it still persist?
Tell us, why is it unhealthy, first of all, for
So
males to dominate? And what does that mean, to dominate, to control, to debase someone? Why is that so unhealthy, both for the person who's doing that and for the society that's doing that, and the person who's on the receiving end, on the groups?
So I mean, it's often like, I guess it's from the surface level, it's more obvious to see why that's more damaging for the person at the bottom of that, because it kind of means that their needs, desires, basic human wants are subordinate to that of the person above them. So it's kind of obvious why that is, why that's
which typically, of course, again, is the male. Okay.
Exactly.
So
and so I think then the typical answer for why does patriarchy persist is like, well, it's obvious. It favors the men, so they're going to keep going. And that assumes that there's an innate human desire to dominate.
Right.
But actually what we show in the book is that our most fundamental human desire is for kind of connection, to be seen, to be known, to love, and to be loved.
Right.
And so to maintain a position of dominance, you have to sacrifice all those feelings of care, of vulnerability. You have to show that you're the strong man. And I mean, you just need to look at I don't know if the statistics are this stark in this country, but in the UK, I think it's the second largest killer of men between the ages of 18 to 40 is suicide. Mm-hmm. Because it's incredibly emotionally damaging to kind of, in order to hold this position of being the all-strong dominating man, to completely have to repress and silence those more vulnerable needs for connection.
So in order to protect you, that's what you're saying too, right, in the book, to protect you from the vulnerabilities of love and intimacy, patriarchy raises its head there to keep you from doing that, and yet we're not aware that we're acting in a very self-destructive way and destructive way.
Well, so this is kind of, the book started with a bit of a puzzle for us.
Right.
So it kind of began with, I was one of Carol's students, and
you were?
I was one of Carol's
at
students.
NYU, okay.
Yeah, so I was a lawyer. I was at NYU doing a master's in law, and I took this very strange sounding course called Resisting Injustice that I thought, that sounds fascinating. Mm-hmm. And really and truly, I think I was in the dark ages somewhat when it came to questions of feminism, because it just really wasn't that much in my consciousness.
Connecting to resisting injustice.
So the class connects kind of, it looks at various forms of injustice, including like racism, patriarchy, class structures, and it looks at how we resist those structures. And one of the books that we read in that class is a book called The Birth of Pleasure, which was written by Carol Gilligan in 2002, I think. Mm-hmm. And in that book, it's the first time in Carol's work where she uses the term patriarchy. And she parallels patriarchy and democracy in that book as well. Right. And she contrasts love with patriarchy and kind of connects love and democracy as being aligned, and patriarchy as being antithetical to this innate desire to love. And not only does patriarchy get in the way of human connection, but human connection is the way out of patriarchy.
Right.
So, like, to put it very simply, like if we're to maintain a system of domination and submission between the two of us, you have to become kind of disconnected from your capacity to kind of feel any empathy for me.
To even listen to you and think that what you're going to say is important.
Exactly, because if I say to you, this hurts so much for me to not be able to say how I think, how I feel. If you're connected to yourself, you'll feel empathy, and you'll be compelled to do something to change it. I mean, some of our greatest liberation movements have been built on kind of the power of love. Martin Luther King, it was so in there. So she basically says love is the way out of patriarchy. and it's in all of our human interests to love. So then it was
To connect.
to connect.
Not only, and by doing that, we're connecting to our deepest needs.
Exactly.
And patriarchy gets in the way of that by subjugating us to a role that
isn't natural. We're disconnected from ourselves, and we become disconnected from others. So then we were like, but then why? Why, if love is the way out, if we have this design capacity to connect as humans,
deep desires and wants,
right?
It doesn't happen.
Exactly. So that we began with that puzzle in mind, and so basically, what we ended up discovering was that the reason why patriarchy persists is because it basically subverts our capacity. Like all relationships, you kind of go in and out of touch. You have ruptures. And what patriarchy does is it gets...
Ebbs and flows?
Ebbs and flows.
Okay, yeah.
And so...
people are going to get upset with each other and so on in the natural course of things.
Exactly. And so in order for you to want to stay connected with someone, you have to have trust and hope that those ruptures can be repaired. That if in a moment, like you get angry with me and it hurts me, for me to say, hey, that really hurt when you did that, I've got to have trust in the fact that you're gonna listen. And what
I will.
well, what we discovered is that if you're a patriarchal man, you wouldn't, and if I was a patriarchal woman, I wouldn't tell you because what patriarchy does is it shames that capacity for repair. So, for example,
how dare you even question me? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, or like say it's young girls, for example, or even older women. It's the classic like nasty woman thing. You know, you're a bossy, selfish, angry, shrill woman. If you stand up for yourself, you know, I mean, you see it in the kind of debates over like kind of Me Too. On the one hand, you know, there's a lot of support for women, but on the other, a lot of the time there's this like,
don't go too far.
Well, you've just ruined this man's life. You know, like the shaming of that kind of, that standing up for yourself and that it's...
Help us on that. I mean, that's a very concrete, terrific example. Is there a little bit of truth on both sides of that? Or is it, you know, it is a riveting, traumatic experience for both, and how do you create an environment where people do come forward and heal? Because that doesn't happen often, doesn't it? Does it?
I don't think that it. I don't think healing is typically kind of seen at the forefront of our criminal justice system. I don't think that's the goal it has in mind.
But so should it be?
I think so. I really do.
Restorative justice.
Yeah, and I think so. You know, to blame the woman for ruining a man's life by coming forward and saying what's happened, I think is to mislocate the source of the problem there, because all the woman's doing is saying this thing happened and it was wrong and it should be known and acknowledged and something should be done about it.
There should be due process or some sort of fair procedure, right?
Yeah.
As a lawyer, you would recommend that.
But I don't think as justice systems we've really worked out what due process looks like in the case of rape. I think it's a really complicated question, right? Because, you know, issues of, corroborating evidence, often it isn't. Often it's one person's word against the other.
Yes.
You know, like what become fair issues to bring in to discredit a woman. And I think if we look, like a lot of the evidence that has been brought in has been kind of against women in those cases, kind of
They've had to
reveals
prove themselves
they've had to prove
in some
very
way
often
they're
that
worth.
that they're pure women.
That
That is, if
you
you
didn't
know,
lead the guy on.
you didn't lead him on. That you don't have a history of like being
okay.
too
You're loose or
sexual.
whatever.
Yeah, you know, that certain women can be believed and certain can't. And so I think, and I think there's a really example of, you know, we say that for patriarchy to persist, it rests on men's violence and women's silence. And so why have women remained silent for so long? And I think rape is a really good example of why, because so long they knew that to speak out would be to not be believed. So, and so you go along with a system that kind of harms you because you begin to feel like that's the only
You're the
option.
problem. You internalize it.
Yeah.
And become depressed about it, and also internalize rage.
Exactly.
So
I
it
think
gets
so often it's not just like you begin to blame yourself. We
Yeah.
quote I think it's a really wonderful line from a long dead British psychoanalyst, so it's kind of strange to be quoting him on a kind of question of like why patriarchy persists, but he was talking about the children and the trauma of growing up in neglectful or unresponsive families, and why those children so often come to blame themselves. And he says it's better to believe that you're a sinner growing up in a world ruled by God than you're an angel in a world ruled by the devil. And you know, so it's like that distortion of like it's better to start believing it's your fault than really, because if you really acknowledged how the problem was outside, and then you would just be so angry and you feel like there was nothing to do about that. But you know, if you turn it against yourself, you feel like, okay, there's something I can do about it. I just have to improve myself.
Blaming the victim, as other groups have had to do too. So that's why these movements of resistance that then become proactive and also attempt to educate, raise consciousness becomes so important.
Yeah.
Not only for the victims, but for those who are victimizing groups. But wow, so this becomes, and again, the issue of trauma is so central to this. What do you mean by that? I know you've personally experienced the trauma of losing your own father at an early age. How is that tied in to the work?
It's tied in first and foremost because it was really reflecting on my own experience of losing my father and how that impacted me, which kind of led Carol and I to this work in the first place. Like I was telling you, kind of this puzzle that we came to, sort of reading Carol's work and saying, okay, love's the way out. Why do we sacrifice love for patriarchy? And as I reflected on that question, I thought, well, I know why. Like I've done that. I've sacrificed love, authentic connection for as long as I can remember. So I was...
Because of the loss. You were fearful.
Basically, I was 5 years old when my father died.
Right.
And I think on, you know, some very unconscious level...
Are you your only child? Or,
No, I have an older sister.
Sister, okay. And much older was she?
She was 8.
8, so it was... And how was your mother?
Sorry?
How was your mother after this trauma as well? So
I think I think we were all really devastated by it. I think really devastated, and I think for me, I think I probably unconsciously blamed myself a lot, but really was like, if I could control myself, if I could just be whoever the other person wanted me to be, then I could avoid losing them. And there's this quote that Carol gives in one of her books of 12-year-old Iris, who says, oh no, maybe she's older than that, but she says, you know, if I was to say what I really thought and felt, no one would want to be with me. But you have to have relationships. And I was like, wow, that's
what you were feeling
That's
too.
what I felt the whole time. And I thought, oh, well, I'm just so terrified of loss. I completely kind of do these somersaults to try and kind of become like this almost emotional, relational chameleon.
Not truly deal with it.
Yeah,
in a
well,
sense.
not truly.
To hide your pain.
To hide my pain, also to hold myself. It's almost like I was the puppet master. I was, on the surface, I was very relational. Like I had, and we make these distinction between relationships and relationships. I seemed, I had plenty of friends. I was in a relationship, but part of me was always on the outside, directing the action, never fully being completely present. On the one hand, because I was terrified if I was really myself, then they'd leave. But also it's an insurance policy. If I'm not really myself and you do go, then I'm a little protected. So kind of we saw, well, actually...
It's a hell of a way to go through life.
it's a really
exhausting.
tragic way to go through life. And I think I think it's way more common than many of us would like to admit.
I believe that's true.
And I think what we're doing in this book is connecting that way of being that's kind of a that's rooted in psychological defenses that from a psychological perspective is seen as, defenses. They're often adaptive on the one hand.
Seemingly.
We don't develop defenses for no reason. We develop them in traumatic situations to protect ourselves. The problem is, over time, they become harmful. So basically we're saying what from a psychological standpoint seems to be these defenses against loss are what from a patriarchal standpoint have been held up as the archetypes of the masculine man and the feminine woman who's completely selfless in relationship, who take care.
So the system wants you to perpetuate that at a political, economic, psychological level as well. So it's like the iron cage here that you're in. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the male suffers as well from this type of relation because they're not experiencing true intimacy and love, and they're seeking it where? Money, power, force.
Exactly.
And this is where the links, I think, that the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the environmental movement, and others are so. It's so important for us to see the links of domination and oppression and racism and sexism and so on, because it's again the patriarch, and we see it, daily, nightly with our president here, and his search for whatever meaning, but the meaning is rooted in him, power, how much money I have, and so on, and threats and force to make sure that continues. Yeah. That worldview and wanting to control the world's vision of him, and it gets preposterous, and it gets so destructive that we're taping this at the same time that the House committee is hearing Michael Cohen, and I was telling you right before the show the last question I heard from actually was a Republican asking Michael Cohen before I had to leave to do our show was mind-boggling. He said, "What do you think Donald Trump fears the most?" And Cohen couldn't answer it. He said, "That's a great question."
Yeah. What do you think?
I don't know. Well, yeah, that's what I was hoping he would say. He said, I think he may have said that. What do you think? You're asking me?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you. All right. I think there's an emptiness and a loss. And if you look at, which we haven't done that much, Trump's own background, and I mean, which I think A&E is doing an expose of that. He was sent, 8, 9 years old to military school, in which he was disciplined, beat up, controlled.
Yeah.
Because at home he sought to be and was seen by his authoritarian father as rebellious. So the cycle repeats.
It
perpetuates.
Exactly.
And this is not just now about just a mere individual, but it's a mere individual who has enormous power to control the destiny of us all. And literally, to accelerate the destruction of the world.
And I mean, so it can sound kind of almost ridiculous to, I guess, like have a psychological perspective on something that seems so much bigger. But when you realize that one person's pathology,
as a sociologist, I say that it's not at all.
But like, and to see how like one person's pathology can have such a tremendous impact is kind of mind-boggling.
And then so it's not, it's, as you're recognizing with Carol too, it's the structure, it's the political structure, the economic structure that supports that.
Yeah.
But yet we do have choices now. So we do have movements of resistance.
Yes.
And we're beginning to understand that. And again, it's as I was saying in the opening, it's depressing after the struggles of the last few decades to again go back to the sort of president we now have to deal with, the sort of vision he's trying to impose. And so that's, again, another reason why this book is so important, because it can offer us an understanding.
Yeah.
And I do think it's extraordinarily important. What you're doing here is showing the psychological and the connection to the political. And I would also, and also add this dimension of love.
Yeah.
And radical love, which the program has been about often in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And that's the way out of this. I like the way you put it.
And also I think maybe there's something that we could, and I'd love to hear more about the conception of radical love, because sometimes I think love gets a bit of, in these conversations, a bit of a bad rep, because it can sound a little bit wishy-washy.
Right.
But like what...
We don't mean that, but
yeah,
go
like,
ahead.
well, because actually like one of our really, we think it's kind of a fascinating discovery was we looked at the work of this British psychologist called John Bowlby.
Yes.
And he
Maternal.
was really, he looked at
yes.
like he was a pioneer in looking at kind of infant research, and he really
It's the 50s, right?
the 50s, yeah, and
okay.
he really discovered, which kind of sounds bonkers that it wasn't known, but he really discovered that the incredibly powerful impact of, you know, then it was seen as the maternal bond, but really it's just the bond between infant and caregiver. And he saw how when that bond was ruptured, the incredible psychological harm
Tell us
that
a
was
little about
caused.
the experiment, because for our audience, the attachment,
Yeah. So
idea of attachment. What was this experiment about?
Well, so what he didn't do experiments in the beginning. What he did was he observed children.
Okay.
Back then, when children went to hospitals, there was no visiting from parents. So these young children would be away from their parents for like days, weeks, and he video recorded.
What age now?
Like these were like from
2, 3,
babies
4.
to toddlers.
Okay.
And what he noticed it, I think, from 6 months on.
Really?
Was when he, I think that was the age that he first started noticing these patterns. And basically he observed 3 stages of response to loss. The first stage, which I think is very interesting in terms of your idea of radical love, the first stage in our response to loss is protest. And I think that's just a really kind of, when you really sit and think about it, that's a really radical observation.
Now, both male and female toddlers.
Exactly. This is like, so what you realize is like the need for connection is completely
in the
genderless.
process of what, crying and just
like crying is
raising hell. Where'd everybody go here?
Yeah, you know,
where'd
like,
my love go?
When I was in therapy, like my first time round, and I used to struggle so much to know what I wanted. And my therapist used to say, when you were a baby and you knew you wanted that rattle, you didn't question it, you didn't doubt it, you knew what you wanted and you went for it. Is that not the kind of clearest expression of speaking truth to power, when a baby cries, when its parent in some way
responds positively? There's nothing better than
exactly.
you gain an idea of who you are and what the world is
exactly
like.
And it's not to say that, you know, ruptures are inevitable, that the caregiver is going to at some points be not be present in the way that the infant wants them to, but that power that in that moment the baby realizes that when I cry you respond and we can repair it is so meaningful. But when protest fails,
Didn't Freud say too, a child who is doted upon will stay with that child the rest of their lives? I mean, there's something to be said about that. All right,
Yeah.
anyway. But if you're not, okay, so the
So when-
protest,
when-
and when the protest is not being satisfied,
Well, then you have
recognize.
despair. And you
Despair.
have the listlessness and
That's
the
the second stage.
hopelessness.
Okay.
And you know, the
Listlessness,
kind of,
okay.
yeah, like feelings of just depression.
Wow.
And then
That's Donald Trump at 2 o'clock in the morning, right before he then
starts tweeting.
Starts tweeting. Okay, no.
And then you have the detachment phase. And so that was when they observed gets complicated, but basically what they observed was that was when the children would no longer seem to care about the loss, and they would turn instead to material things.
Wow.
So like when the parents then came to visit, they took no interest in the parents but became more interested by the gifts the parents gave.
Material things.
Yeah, they sublimate their desire for
money,
connection.
The
Exactly.
material. Okay.
And so not only do you at that point disconnect from relationships, there was even like an emotional disconnection from the feeling of sadness that accompanied the loss. So that's when you get that's how in a way you can understand the kind of the masculine mode of kind of
The emptiness inside.
the inner emptiness and the like, I don't need anybody. I'm like, and we're not talking about men here. Like, this is not biological. This is like masculinity. This is like
Right.
what is held up as the ideal of masculinity is the guy that's more into money, women as objects, right? Women as gifts and material
Right.
objects,
Right.
not as relationships. But they can stand on their own 2 feet. They don't need anyone or no one.
Right.
They can build a wall, right? Between
Right, exactly. Towers and
Yeah,
names and-
exactly.
It's not just him, right? Exactly. Wow. So with that insight, which is incredible. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, so I was just thinking in terms of your question of resistance, what we show is there are always these two responses to loss. There's protest or there's detachment. And I think what's really kind of what gives us a lot of hope right now is that as things are getting worse, as kind of
Right.
the oppression and the oppression that's been there, maybe under the surface for some of us, not all of us, for a while, is becoming more and more obvious. I think people are getting angrier and angrier. And you're seeing, rather than just despair and detachment, we're seeing people...
Action.
We're seeing action.
Attempts to counter.
And driven by what we call, taking Bowlby's phrase, is we call it the anger of hope versus the anger of despair. It's
I like
not
that, yeah.
it's not a destructive rage, it is anger in the surface of reconnection. And something like love does not always look pretty. Love is sometimes saying sometimes when you love someone you have to say things
Well,
that are
that's
going to
part of what
hurt
radical.
them, right?
That's right. It's response to catastrophe, and to love it's messy,
Yes.
and you might attempt to love in a world that doesn't return it. And even with a mother, one would hope and expect mother's love, but that mother may not be loving you either. So that's part of what radical love is. It's listening to people who perhaps been the most hurt by it, and how do you deal with that catastrophic trauma? How do you maintain your integrity, your courage in the face of this? Because you don't want to give in to that hopelessness and nothingness, which, by the way, with work that Jim Gilligan's work in the prisons show, can often lead to violence.
Violence, exactly.
Because you're so dead inside, and to almost feel that you're alive, which is obviously a horrible, destructive way of doing this. You lash out in the rage and so on. So we've got to absolutely learn other ways of dealing with this. And so what you're talking about at the psychological level is also something we need to look at in terms of societally and economically.
Yeah.
And civilizations have to be transformed.
I think as individuals we need to look at kind of our own capacity for resistance, but I think as society we need to look at how responsive our structures are.
Policies.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other young women who are forefront, the 106, I guess, that they're now in Congress. So, that we're putting a lot of pressure on them. We're hopes of, and we've got to add too here that leaders come and go, and they're constantly raising hope, which is often dashed. Other things I could say about this now, but I think so we need to go politically transcend just having a woman as president. We need to have a woman or a man who understands the dynamics you're talking about here. And I'm not so sure we've had that in the recent past at all.
Do you think Obama embodied? I mean,
cerebrally. Incredibly bright, but look at the policies. And he talks about a hypermasculinity, and he's very, very convincing, and he's brilliant and charming and so on. But look at the policies. That's what people like Reverend William Barber and Cornel West were talking about. Structural changes here.
Yeah.
What are you doing about poverty?
Yeah.
You're still sending disproportionately young black men into federal prisons, which he did. You're expanding the wars that George Bush was involved. So what is that about?
Well, you know what I think is so fascinating is seeing how.
And Hillary was certainly not a dove. Didn't seem to be. She turned people who were against her into the deplorables. So how understanding is her femininity or her reaction to some of the Me Too? The Black Lives Matter people who challenged her, and her labeling of young black men and as predators.
Yeah.
And back in the 90s, and we won't get into Bill Clinton, but so it's a problem that transcends.
Well, I think for a long
gender
time, and I
too.
think this absolutely transcends gender. I think what's really fascinating right now and really hopeful.
Yes.
I think for so long there was this idea, well, you know, you couldn't get ahead in the left unless you made certain compromises, unless you kind of like towed certain lines. And I think what you are seeing now with, I think Ocasio-Cortez is such an example of this, of refusing to do that, of saying, no, I'm not gonna compromise on, I'm not gonna kind of take that utilitarian kind of like means to an end kind of approach. No, I'm going to stay.
She's got a value structure too.
Yeah, and I'm going to stick to that and trust that actually that will garner support versus thinking, no, that's impossible. No one's gonna, like, I think we're showing that the impossible, what a lot of people want to label as impossible is really not.
And she's catching hell and going to catch much more hell as how audacious this young Latina woman is here. So, you know.
And there's such pushback, but I think she's also an answer to kind of the question of what do you do when there's such pushback? Because at the same time as there's all this pushback, I don't know, she's like a celebrity. How many millions of supporters does she have on Twitter? I think that's what enables people to be, to come up against these structures is if you feel like you've got support, if you're resonating with some people, then I think that's really sustaining.
I think that's true. I think that's an important component of this. Now, remains to be seen within the political structures we have it, and the domination of the prison military-industrial complex, how she butts heads with that, and she's going to need a lot of support for that. And at this point, it remains to be seen how many will really make a difference there in really turning this around. And again, we can't expect it all to happen all at once here. But so tell me again, the therapeutic process. If somehow you could, let me turn that question on to you. Here, let's say you're because you are planning a career in clinical work. So here we are. Donald Trump is in your office. Somehow, I don't know, someone told him if you come to, I don't know. Somehow he's made it to your office.
Yeah.
He's open to listening. How would you start?
Oh, wow. Wow, what a question.
Yeah. Presuming that, okay, I don't know, whatever, he's got to be there for some reason. Maybe he just, at some point, he's realizing, wow, you know what? I'm not really very happy here. Or for whatever presenting reason, he's found his way into your office.
You know, and this
How would you begin to deal with his trauma?
Well, so this is the thing. This has been a really difficult lesson for me to learn. Becoming a clinician is really tough. I was trained to become a lawyer before. So I was a lawyer before.
What kind of law did you do?
So I did my law degree in England. I was a corporate lawyer to begin with, and then shifted into human rights law.
Okay.
But I'm a natural arguer. Like, that's the way that I, like,
Okay.
and what I've realized is, and I think this is why part of me wanted to leave her in ways, you don't persuade it. Like,
yeah,
you don't
can't
change anything by arguing. And it's been a really, you know, sometimes I'll find myself getting into arguments with my patients, and it's like, you know, so when I want to, like, clinically, what would I do? And, you know, and I don't think this is an easy thing, but I think first and foremost, and I think it's the potentially healing thing, is to really, really try and listen.
Yes, and we only have a couple more minutes, but you are the founder of NYU's Radical Listening Project. So what does that mean? You are listening to people who are often not listened to, and listening.
You know what I
deeply.
think? Listening's a really complicated thing to do, and just to be real, because people speak in so many different voices, like individuals. So and as we listen, we often want to categorize and put, like, oh, this, like, I'm going to put this into this box, and when you say this, it means that. Like, we want to organize and understand anything. To just really take in what someone's saying and really listen to it is a really difficult thing. So what the Radical Listening Project does is it takes this mode of listening that Carol Gilligan established in her research, called the listening guide method, and it's a way of listening that kind of captures the voice that speaks beneath the voice, like in the way that we can become divided against ourselves. Right. So you can maybe have the top layer, which for some people might be this very patriarchal, masculine voice. And it's kind of like, okay, well, there's that voice. Let's listen to that. Like, well, let's listen to it. Let's understand that. But let's also make room for the voices beneath it to kind of open narratives. And I think what I've noticed in my work as a clinician is, once you really listen to what someone's saying, very often, and you're sensing, I'm not sure I'm hearing everything here, but then they will often then say, well, actually, what I really think is blah. So if you listen to someone, it opens up the layers.
You know what? We've got less than 30 seconds to go. I could listen to this. I know our audience can listen to this for hours and hours. This has been terrific, and we've got to send this to Donald Trump. Yeah. We've got to get him to your office.
Give him my number.
Okay, we will. Carol Gilligan, Naomi Snider, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? It's a fabulous book. Get it. And thank you so much.
Thank you so
Naomi.
much.
It's been terrific.
It's really great.
It was terrific.